So hello and welcome to this NPTEL course titled The Novel and Change. We'll start with a new novel today, which happens to be Mary Shelley's very famous novel, Frankenstein. Now, in this particular session and in the subsequent session as well, we look at the background of the novel. So what we'll do is we will start looking at some of the secondary scholarship on the novel, and through the secondary scholarship, we'll come to the main text, if you will. Now, the edition we're using to study this text is the 2017 MIT Press edition, which is interestingly meant for scientists and engineers. So as you can see, this should be on your screen. This is a very interesting logo of Frankenstein on your screen, and it's annotated for scientists, engineers, and creators of all kinds. So it's a very different and radically new approach to the novel. I mean, this is an edition which is not meant it's not designed specifically and only for humanities scholars, but also encompassing and addressing scientists and engineers, because I think part of the editorial effort in this novel, in this edition, is to also look at how this novel can be seen, can be read, can be examined as a cautionary tale for scientists, as something which can be addressed to scientists, and how, because the content of the plot in the novel is about the misadventures in science. It's about what goes wrong in a very, very hubristic scientific experiment, which we'll talk about in a minute. Right? So annotated for scientists, engineers, and creators of all kinds. And these are the editors, David Guston, Ed Finn, and Jason Scott Robert. So very, very interesting names who looked at this book. And this is Mary Shelley. As you know, Mary Shelley wrote this one novel which made a very, very famous, and is one of the most famous novels ever, Frankenstein, and it's almost acquired a mythical status. The whole idea of creating this super scientific creature who ends up becoming a quote-unquote monster. And we'll talk about the entire politics of monstrosity in a bit. But the danger it creates for science, the danger it creates for society, and in many ways, it's a cautionary tale about the limitless ambition in science, the limitlessness in science. So what happens if you do unprincipled science? And then, of course, the whole idea of moral accountability. So what happens to once you create a quote-unquote creature? I mean, are you accountable for it? Are you accountable for its actions? And can you be held morally accountable as a creator for that creature who becomes a problem for the system, right? Now, we'll not go too deep into biographical details, so we'll skip this bit a little bit and then move on to the introduction and somewhat the preface. So as you can see, this is MIT Press, Cambridge, Massachusetts, London, England, published in 2017. So I just want to spend a little bit of time talking about the edition, because I think it makes sense, it's relevant given how we are about to study this novel, the kind of press, the kind of edition that we are looking at, and what are the intellectual implications of choosing this particular version of the novel. Now, we look at the editor's preface a little bit in the first session before we move on to the introduction by Charles E. Robinson. So what we'll do is we'll look at the secondary criticism, the secondary scholarship, and find a way back into reading the text, as it were, instead of looking at the text directly. We'll also look at certain selected passages, certain selected sections of the novel, which lend themselves, as it were, to interesting critical reading of various kinds. So, as you can see, there are many essays in this particular edition about traumatic responsibility, the changing conceptions of human nature, undisturbed reality, and the whole idea of the Promethean quality in the novel as well. Now, Prometheus, of course, as you know, is a mythical figure who is seen as an archetype for subversion, an archetype for doing something which is prohibited, and as a result, stealing fire from the gods, this old ancient myth. And as a result, he would be tied to a stone, and a vulture would peck at his body. So it becomes an allegory for an archetype for subversion, and the retribution that comes, the consequences of subversion, the consequences of doing something immoral, something which is transgressive in quality. So in many ways, this novel is also about transgression, about crossing the boundary, crossing the permissible perimeter of science, of knowledge, of creation, and what are the consequences which follow once one does it. Now, as I mentioned, I will spend a little bit of time today, especially the first section, looking at the editor's preface, and this is written by David Guston, Ed Finn, and Jason Scott Robert. And as you can see, the preface is interesting because it talks about how this book is important for scientists today in terms of how the choice of this edition. Why is this edition important? And why should we have this novel taught not just to humanities scholars, not just to social sciences scholars, but to scientists, to engineers, to creators, to innovators, to techno-innovators today. So in many ways, Frankenstein, I think, is a very relevant text for us. I mean, now that we find ourselves in this entire debate about artificial intelligence, this entire debate about genetic creation, biogenetics, and all the rest of it, this novel, which is about transgressing the biological boundaries of creation, transgressing the biological norms of creation and procreation, it really resonates in the kind of intellectual, social, moral debates we have around us today. So this should be on your screen. The very first paragraph of the preface that we will read line by line in order to get the real spirit of this edition, the real spirit of this draft, and how this edition becomes a very important way to enter the text, and through the text the different kind of cultural situations that this particular text is corresponding to. So as is there on the screen, no work of literature has done more to shape the way human beings or humans imagine science and its moral consequences than Frankenstein or the modern Prometheus. So I mentioned how the subtitle is important. The allegory of the Promethean figure is important for us because the Prometheus, of course, emerges as the archetype of subversion, the allegory of subversion, and in that sense it becomes an important figure because there is subversion, there is transgression in Frankenstein as well. So Mary Shelley's remarkably enduring tale of creation and responsibility. So, this is some kind of interesting anecdote, but one can easily and safely say that Mary Shelley's novel, Frankenstein, has had more of a lasting legacy than anything written by a famous poet husband, Percy Bysshe Shelley, a major romantic poet. Some of you would have read Shelley's poetry. He's got his famous poem called Prometheus Unbound. And of course, he was seen at this time as well as later in scholarship on romantic literature as one of the major romantic poets, along with William Wordsworth, Samuel Taylor Coleridge, Lord Byron, and John Keats. Shelley was seen very much in line, the same pedigree of poetry. However, as I mentioned, that Mary Shelley's novel Frankenstein or the Modern Prometheus has had more of a lasting effect, more of a legacy, if you will, in terms of literary output, in terms of literary reception. Now, just a little bit of a biographical detail. We will not go too far into it, but we need to know that Frankenstein is a literary offspring, as is there on the screen, is a literary offspring of an 18-year-old girl ensconced in a romantic yet fraught summer getaway on the shores of Lake Geneva in response to a dare to come up with a ghost story. So this was a contest, some kind of funny contest, write a ghost story in which Lord Byron as well as Percy Bysshe Shelley were also involved to come up with a ghost story, which would be the scariest one. And Mary Shelley started writing Frankenstein as part of this almost comical contest, the dare contest, to come up with a ghost story. That dare was issued a little more than 200 years ago. In writing Frankenstein, Mary produced both in the creature and its creator tropes that continue to resonate deeply with contemporary audiences. So, as I just mentioned, that perhaps Frankenstein resonates more complexly, more deeply, more immediately in contemporary bioscientific, infoscientific culture that we inhabit today, not limited to algorithms and artificial intelligence and biotechnology and bioscience and biogenetics. So in a way, it continues to resonate in a very diachronic ways, across generations, in a very intergenerational way. Moreover, these tropes and imaginations they engender actually influence the way we confront emerging science and technology. So our confrontation, our intellectual, moral confrontations with science and technology, we find it's interesting representation of the same confrontation happening in this novel, in this fictional novel. Conceptualize the process of scientific research, imagine the motivations and ethical struggles of scientists, and weigh the benefits of scientific research against the anticipated and unforeseen pitfalls. right? So as you can see, it's a very loaded sentence. So it talks about the anticipated perils, the precarity of scientific creation. And in many ways, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein may be seen as a novel about precarity, as a novel about the production of precarity, which is also the flip side of knowledge, the flip side of a super scientific progress. So in the process of creating a super scientific episteme, if you talk about episteme as a knowledge mode, as a knowledge network, as a knowledge structure, in the process of creating that knowledge structure, what we also get in this particular novel is the precarity which is produced alongside the knowledge structure. So I think in a way this particular edition, as I mentioned, in terms of how it appeals to scientists today, it appeals to bioscientists, it appeals to technoscientists today, is interesting. And so this edition, which is meant for that kind of a readership, is also a very, very innovative way to read the novel. Now, Mary Shelley's landmark fusion, and this should be on the screen, the final paragraph on the page. Mary Shelley's landmark fusion of science, ethics, and literary expression provides an opportunity both to reflect on how science is framed and understood by the public, and to contextualize new scientific and technological innovations, especially in an era of synthetic biology, genome editing, robotics, machine learning, and regenerative medicine. So as you can see, the vocabulary here is very modern. It's extremely contemporary. It's extremely relevant to the world we live in today. And this edition is a 2017 edition, so less than 7 years ago. So very, very contemporary, very relevant to our times. And some of the things which I mentioned in this preface, synthetic biology, genome editing, machine learning, robotics. So these are things which are very, very important. These are big intellectual debates. These are big scholarly debates. A lot of capital, a lot of intellectual capital, real capital. They invest in these kind of research. So Frankenstein becomes an important fictional representation to calibrate the anxieties, the precarities, the possibilities around these kind of research. Although Frankenstein is infused with the exhilaration and of seemingly unbounded human creativity, it also prompts serious reflection about our individual and collective responsibility for nurturing the products of our creativity and imposing constraints on our capacities to change the world around us, right? So the word important, the very important word over here is, the idea of constraints. So should there be any constraints in our capacity to change the world around us? Should there be any territory, any legal territory, any knowledge? This is why we inhabit, or we come by the entire entanglement of knowledge and legality. So what should be legal knowledge? What should be illegal knowledge? To what extent should knowledge be free? To what extent should knowledge and creativity be allowed to run, uninhibited? Or should there be any protection? Should there be any security? Should there be any territory within which knowledge should operate? Because subverting that or transgressing that may cause moral dilemmas, may cause social problems. So these are the ethical questions that we grapple with today. All the big scientific institutes today, they have this human rights section, they have this ethics section, they have this accountability section. And as you know, almost all big major scientific experiments and scientific projects have to mark themselves, compatible with ethics exercises. The entire ethics debate is important today, as it should be, right? Of course, connected to ethics is the question of accountability. To what extent is science accountable? To what extent is scientific technology accountable in terms of its manifestations, in terms of its, its impact on society, immediate as well as long-lasting impact? And these are questions, these are issues which the novel, Mary Shelley's novel, flags up in very, very complex ways. So engaging with Frankenstein allows a broad public, and especially future scientists and engineers, to consider the history of its scientific progress together with our expanding abilities in the future, and to reflect on evolving understandings of the responsibilities such abilities entail. So the question of responsibility becomes important. The whole futuristic quality of science becomes important. So it's not just enough to say that this is an immediate exciting work in the present. One also has to anticipate its short-term as well as long-term effects in the future. And to what extent the anticipated effects should contribute towards the calibration of the contemporary scientific project. Should we be more guarded in a scientific project? Should we be more careful and cautioned in a scientific project? Should there be a cautionary quality about the technological advancement, or should we be allowed to run untrammeled, just purely on creative spirit? Right. So these are the ethical questions, and of course, as you can imagine, these are very gray areas. There's no right or wrong answer to this debate. There's no neat or decisive answer to these kind of questions, very complex questions. But this is a book, this is a novel which really opens up this can of worms and allows us, or invites us really, to engage with these ethical questions, very deep, dark ethical questions around the notion of and the ontology of creation, procreation, reproduction, and accountability of science. Okay, so this is the philosophical moral framework that this novel is espousing, and then we have this this big debate about how the edition came into being. But just to give you a context in terms of how the ontology of the creature appears in Frankenstein, this should be on your screen. It's worth pointing out that the way we now use the word creature ignores a richer etymology. So some of the words we use today may have come from different roots. So we consider these words to be something different, but semantically and etymologically. But if you go back to the roots of these words, you find that there's a different etymological investment, an entanglement, which we should bear in mind as students of literature, as scholars of literature. Today we refer to birds and bees as creatures. Living things are creatures by virtue of their livingness. So there's an automatic association of animation and something being a creature. So it must have life, it must have life spirit, it must be biological, it must be organic in order to be considered as a creature, in order to be classified as a creature. When we call something a creature today, we rarely think in terms of something that has been created, and thus we erase the idea of a creator behind the creature, right? So this disconnect or decoupling between the creator and the creature is something of a modern phenomenon, right? It wasn't there since inception. We've likewise lost the social connotation of the term creature, for creatures are made not just biologically or magically, but also socially, right? The social construction of creation is something we must remind ourselves of. In a contemporary film, Victor Frankenstein in 2015, for example, Harry Potter's Daniel Radcliffe plays Igor, Victor's hunchback assistant. So again, we find how not present in Mary's novel, but invented for stage and screen. So, Daniel Radcliffe, who is famous for playing Harry Potter, the eponymous hero in J.K. Rowling's novel, he plays this interesting character called Igor, who is not there in the original novel, but he obviously serves a symbolic purpose. Invented for stage and screen, who was rescued from a circus, cured of his malformation, and embraced by Victor first as assistant and then as partner in his laboratory, right? So he is someone who is differently abled, who has a physical problem, but he is cured by Victor Frankenstein in this particular adaptation, and he subsequently goes on to become Victor's partner in the laboratory, from being an assistant to a partner. So more and more agency acquired in the process, as you can imagine. Victor raises him from a subhuman existence, even giving him the name Igor, because the freak show hunchback has no name, and makes him an English gentleman worthy of invitations to clubs and balls, and even the affection of a beautiful woman. Now, this should remind you, and the reason why I'm reading this passage, this should remind you of something similar which happened in Robinson Crusoe, where Crusoe just rescues a quote-unquote cannibal, a quote-unquote savage, and gives him a name, gives him an identity, gives him a social status, and makes him, not just acceptable, but also desirable in many ways, right? So Friday, the character of Friday, the creature Friday, who was created by Robinson Crusoe in Daniel Defoe's novel, some parallel between that and what happens in this adaptation of Frankenstein, where Igor, who's a hunchback, is created, essentially, socially created by Victor, and then he becomes not just an acceptable figure, but also someone who is worthy of affection of a beautiful woman. Igor understands that he is Victor's creature in this regard, but just as surely as if his life were created from non-life, right? So there's a very direct relationship, an organic relationship between creator and creature over here. So the creator had invented or manufactured or gave life to the creature as if the creature didn't have life before. So the creature emerges from non-life into life through the process of creation, which is controlled by the creator. So to recognize both the biological and the social aspects of creation, as well as the failure of Mary's Victor to name his creation, thus rejecting the creature's social creation, we have decided on the creature. So Mary, Victor, and the creature constitute the trinity of our text, right? So the triangulation, if you will, Mary, Victor, and the creature, they constitute the triangulated text that we are about to read. So as you can see how this particular edition is really taking, it has a very interesting take on the entire novel, right? It's giving a very radical reading in terms of locating it within the current contemporary debates in bioscience and artificial intelligence and robotics and machine learning, but also how it invites us back, it forces us to reconsider the relationship between creation and creature, and this whole process of creation, how it's not an accidental process, but an agentive process which involves the maker and, of course, the body which gets made in the end. Right. So, and then we skip a little bit. We come to the the introduction of the novel and how Mary Shelley is obviously the biographical reading of Mary Shelley, and how the whole idea of creating this novel emerged from some kind of a game, but at the same time, it is also important to remember and relocate the writer's situation in the context of this particular work of fiction, because Mary Shelley, of course, went through a series of tragedies, losing several children, biological children, and how the loss of the child, the dead child, is always some kind of a spectral presence in the novel. So that subtext of the dead child, the subtext of the spectral child, is very much an important interpretative act that we must engage in. Now, we move on to the introduction, which is by Charles E. Robinson, and see what that tells us about the novel in terms of how that allows us to frame the reading of the novel, the different frames we can use. So let's find out what kind of focal frames are at play over here. So this is the introduction by Charles Robinson, which tells us, in this novel written by Mary Wollstonecraft Shelley. Now, again, some of you know that Mary Shelley was the daughter of a famous father, wife of a famous husband. But at the same time, she wrote something which is arguably much, much more famous than whatever his father, her father, or husband ever produced. That one novel, Frankenstein, which has been recycled, recirculated, recreated, reconstructed so many times in so many different ways, including new adaptations which have new characters. So in this novel written by Mary Wollstonecraft Shelley, Victor Frankenstein, never called Dr. Frankenstein, leaves behind his idyllic childhood and Edenic Geneva. So interesting how Victor Frankenstein is never called Dr. Frankenstein. So the word doctor, obviously, it connotes something, it implies something, there's a classification to it. And Victor is not part of the classification, and that tells us something in terms of how we should read the novel. So the journey of Victor is, a very interesting journey. He leaves behind his idyllic childhood, is almost a biblical childhood, almost an Oedipal childhood, and then Edenic Geneva, goes to university, studies the latest technologies and medical procedures, creates an unnamed monster. Again, the unnamed monster is important because the whole idea of monstrosity in this novel is formed from an excess, from a problem. So what we also find in the novel is how there's a very thin line between sublimity and monstrosity. So what is sublime? It is also transcendental, but it's also something transgressive about the sublime, because it's transgressing the recognizable borders, the recognizable territories. And that same transgressive quality is also invested in monstrosity, right? So at a very ontological level, the monstrous and the sublime, they are constantly dialoguing with each other. So goes to university, studies the latest technological and medical procedures, creates an unnamed monster, and suffers the dangerous consequences of his pursuit of knowledge when his creature destroys his brother William, his wife Elizabeth, and his best friend Henry Clerval. In short, Frankenstein is a cautionary tale, and it is now for the first time published by the Institute of Technology for the purpose of educating students who are pursuing science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. Right. So as you can see, part of the reason why I also chose this edition is because it addresses a more holistic reading group, right? So we talk about how scientists also a moral responsibility in terms of knowing what is happening to the inventions, in terms of knowing what is happening to the products they're creating out of the lab, right? How is that being utilized? How is that being abused or used or appropriated for different purposes? So, in that sense, this particular edition, this particular take on Frankenstein, if you will, is a very, very innovative take. So, up until this edition, Frankenstein had been primarily edited and published for and read by humanities students, students equally in need of reading this cautionary tale about forbidden knowledge and playing God. So again, Victor Frankenstein novel, he plays God. He wants to replace God. He wants to replace Creator, and he wants to create a body, an organism which is supposedly better, more refined, more sophisticated than man, the species man, right? In order to create a better species, a more sublime species, if you will. And of course, this is a mis-experiment. It is an experiment gone awry. And it comes back to haunt him to the point that he has now to destroy it. That's the entire tale in this particular novel. And to embrace the largest audience, we are publishing what may be also defined as a STEAM edition of Frankenstein, the A edited in for the arts, designs, and humanities. So STEAM edition, the science, technology, engineering, arts, design, and humanities, and of course, mathematics can also be seen as medicine, right? So it's a very holistic epistemic framework that this particular edition is targeting. And what I also invite you to think and consider is how this particular novel is not just a very, very wonderful, complex, fabulous representation of its context, and in the process, representation of the changes happening in that context, which is the whole purpose of this particular course, but how, in a very diachronic way, it keeps speaking to us. And you find this is true for almost all the novels, in fact, all the novels we read in this course, that these novels keep speaking to us in different ways and in very diachronic ways, and they keep getting resonated, they keep finding resonance in terms of how they correspond to contemporary times in 2024 that we inhabit today. So we stop at this point and we continue into a deeper reading of this introduction in the subsequent class. Thank you for your attention.